So Trent is a professor of bushfire behaviour at the University of Melbourne, and he leads the Flare Wildfire Research, and I know is known to some folks throughout the NRM community in Australia who have done some work with him and the team. With that, Trent, I will hand over to you if you want to share screen and start off.
Thanks, Beck. And hopefully the screen has come up now with the presentation view.
Yes, it has.
Excellent. Thank you. And that was a lovely acknowledgement of country. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming today from Wurundjeri land in Melbourne, or NRM. And I live on Wadawurrung and usually work on Dja Dja Wurrung land. And very privileged to live and learn from the traditional owners. And it's something we're increasing within our research team and trying to increase our understanding. And I used this photo of our team, and it was actually from a cultural training day we did at the start of this year with Jara and Amos there, who's, I was going to say he's the bearded guy with the glasses, but there's a few of those. Amos told us a lot about the history of Indigenous people on Australia, and then focused in on Jara and the changes that they've gone through in the time they've been there. Apart from Amos there and Miriam, there's the rest of them are our team. We have a diverse group of people from all over the place, and with a diverse range of interests. Just a bit of background in what we're trying to do. The ultimate goal is really to improve the scientific basis of predicting fire behaviour and the impacts of values in the landscape. And that's, when we dig into it, that's really quite a broad field, and I'll go through that. And while that's really the goal, there's a lot of interesting steps. Well, I think they're interesting anyway, steps that we take along the way to understand it, and a lot that we learn, not just about fire behaviour, but the impact on human values, but also on environmental values and how we can better manage those into now and into the future. If you jump on our website, which was very nicely designed by a graphic designer, so we don't take any credit for that. He is married to one of our staff, but we did pay him properly. You'll see we've got 5 research themes. The themes, while looking like they're siloed, are actually quite overlapping. So the themes are really just a way for me to deal with things administratively more than anything else. So we have a fire behaviour theme, a landscape flammability, and you can imagine how they interact, and then ecosystem interactions, so that's biodiversity, carbon and water. And then a lot of the learnings that we have from those 3 themes feed into fire risk modelling and also forecasting, or trying to understand what future fire risk might be. And I'll show you a little bit about each of those. We have a whole bunch of research partners. We work with government agencies, electricity networks, plantation companies, fire agencies, Greening Australia, a whole range of different people. And it's really not about trying to give the answer they want, but it's about trying to improve the science. And actually the last 2 days we've been at a workshop with RFS and New South Wales National Parks, and we're reflecting how far risk management and risk planning in fire has come over the last 15 years. 15 years ago, if you asked them the questions we were asking yesterday, we would have been thrown out the window. This time we're only pushed up against it. So it was a fairly major step forward. We also have a bunch of, like most groups, we collaborate in Australia, but we also collaborate internationally with the US Forest Service. While they had a research team there, that's changed in the last few months, sadly. The Canadian Forest Service, and these groups both had the long history of fire, but also a range of fire safety people through the Fire Safety Consortium and other groups you can see there. So I'll just quickly touch on what each of the groups do, and then I'll talk a bit about some of the research tools that we have. So our fire behaviour team is led by Alex Filkov. He's now an associate professor, and he came to us from Siberia and had a long history in engineering, combustion engineering, I should say. And he's built up our fire lab that we have at Creswick, but has also been undertaking some really interesting research, not just in the laboratory with a range of tools that would make James Bond blush, but some field measurements as well to calibrate these. And so the picture on the left there is some work we've been doing on merging fires. So when 2 fires come together, you get an acceleration in that zone. And the most famous example of that is when the 2 fires came together leading into Canberra in 2003. And that's where we saw, I believe it was around Duffy, there was a major house loss and it pushed a long way into the community there because of this emerging fire behaviour. The work Alex has done with a bunch of other collaborators on that project, we were able to look at the lab-based work, and then we did the field measurements and found there was an increase of 4 to 7 times the rate for that emerging fire behaviour, which we can now take those equations, build them into fire behaviour models and better help operational fire prediction for community safety as well as firefighter safety. The other side of it, probably going even bigger scale, is the bottom right is using satellites to map fire progressions. One of the big issues we have with big fires when they're going on or even afterwards is knowing where they were at what time if we're trying to understand impacts as well. So Brendan Hollyland, who was a master's student and has now been working with us for several years now, was able to map the southern half of the Black Summer fires to an accuracy of about 170 metres, which is pretty amazing. It allows us to test fire simulators. It allows us to do a whole bunch of research around impacts and also understand some of the bigger fire runs and the creation of pyro-CB and things like that, working with Jason Sharples. If I move on to the landscape flammability, again, we work from leaves to landscapes in this space. So this is led by Jane Corson, and she's been with us for 8 or 9 years now. And Jane used to work with whatever they were at the time, but is now DECA, the Victorian Environment Department. I think she started there when it was 4 different names ago, and came to us in 2016. And so Jane's been working a lot with Jamie Burton and B. Pickering, looking at understanding the flammability or the time at which things will ignite in the forest, and not only ignite and then what those thresholds might be for fire spread, and coming up with some good models to understand where in the landscape might turn on for fire, and also then at what time during the day. She's also been looking at different management strategies. The picture down the bottom is mulching, which are non-burning strategies to look at what the impact of those may be for fire behaviour, smoke impact on communities, but also what those impacts might be for biodiversity. And then we use that information to put it into our risk modelling to undertake trade-offs in terms of fire risk, biodiversity, etc. And Jane's led a really amazing team and done quite a lot there. So she's been a real high flyer. Our fire and ecosystem interactions is two groups coming together, I guess. So we have Matthew Swan, who's been leading the Victorian Ecosystem Resilience Biodiversity Monitoring, which is somewhere in the order of 1,800 sites across Victoria that they've measured in the last 3 or 4 years, 3 years, I think it is. And looking at habitat structure, fauna diversity and flora diversity, vascular flora diversity. And we've had students which have done work there. So we had Ella Plumans-Poulton, who did a seed bank study out in the Grampians looking at fire history and how that changed seed banks and then resilience moving forward. And we had another student who, Chika, who was looking at using our fire lab, so jumping back to fire behaviour, to look at different intensities on seed release and germination success for Banksias and Hakea, and finding that the increased fire behaviour we're likely to get into the future will not just have ramifications in terms of its frequency, but the success rate of germinants as well. So there's some quite complex patterns emerging with that work. The other half is the work that's led by Lorraine Bennett, and she looks at carbon and active management, of forest. And so looking at how we can better manage our forest and identify trigger points for change when we have interventions to try and maximise ecosystem services there. And she's doing some really interesting work with Tom Fairman as well, with Jara, around their forest gardening program as well, on Tobin Track, just south of Daylesford, if you're familiar with Victoria. And probably the biggest part of our group is around fire risk. To step back in time, which only seemed like yesterday, but about 15 years ago, I started down this path working with Ross Bradstock and developing a way of trying to improve the risk modelling approach that we can use for fire. So we had in the past this idea that we put out ignitions, and Victoria started this with something they called residual risk. You would look at the risk with what they called maximum fuels in the landscape, and then put your fire history in there and then run a whole bunch of ignitions and then calculate how much risk you've reduced. That was a really big step at the time, and there were a lot of improvements that could be made, and we started going down that process. And so working with Brett Cerillis, who's been with me since 2016 as well, we've come up with this pipeline where we look at the weather probabilities, the ignition probabilities, and then we run them through fire simulators, currently using Phoenix, but moving to others as well. And then we've developed a whole bunch of models to assess the impact on a whole range of human and environmental assets as well. And then we can assign costs to those. And then using Bayesian networks, if you're feeling sadistic, I'm happy to talk about those. We can bring those in and come up with bringing the uncertainties together, and we can come up with annualized cost of different management strategies and then compare likely outcomes for a whole range of different asset types there. So this process has worked quite well. It's being used by the New South Wales RFS in their bushfire risk management plans at the moment. And it has fed into the development of Risk 2.0 for Victoria. And we're also working with South Australia for some of their work. Plus, it's formed the basis for a project called IGNIS, which is the national standard for electricity companies to measure the impact of bushfires from their lines with catastrophic consequences. There's a lot of work that's gone into there, but I won't not waste time, but I won't use time talking about that because I want to skip ahead. We've got a bunch of work working around looking at future fire and predicting the changes that might occur and how we might manage that moving forward. And so that's what I'll probably talk about for the rest of this, coming in with nature-based solutions as well. So to go back, there were a couple of papers published around 2010, one by Ross Bradstock, one by Sally Archibald, talking about the drivers of fires and how they vary. These were more what we'd call arm-wavy papers. I can say that because Ross is a good friend, but they were conceptual papers rather than data-driven papers. And they really brought together a lot of knowledge, so they're not that arm-wavy, I guess. But it was saying, Ross in his paper said that there's 4 main switches for fire to occur, and they all have to be on at the same time. So having the right fire weather, the right amount of fuel, the fuel has to be dry enough, and then you have an ignition to spread the fire. And so to take that a little bit further, the rate at which they switch on tell us how much fire we get each year. And then the interannual variability tells us something about the fire regimes that we're likely to get. When looking forward for a long time, a lot of people just talked about fire weather and that increasing, and therefore that would mean that all fires going up everywhere. Research around fuel loads has actually said sometimes it's going up, sometimes it's going down, sometimes it's actually changing in its composition, and that may change things. So we don't really know what happens with biomass. Fuel availability or the dryness of fuel is going up, but the drier the fuels that are there, the less fuels that are actually there in most cases. So there's some interactions which we don't understand there. And then ignitions, depending on who you talk to, lightning might be going up, it might be going down, it might be in different places. We don't know. Human ignitions are most likely to go up. You know, globally, it's the same patterns that people deliberately or accidentally light fires in the same place under the same conditions. So regardless of their intentions, they seem to occur in the same spot. And most of our systems are saturated with ignition, so it probably doesn't matter too much what goes on. But due to some of the limitations in the risk process, particularly in terms for environmental assets, but also for human values like mental health and physical health, we started to move towards an idea that we needed to model not just fires for one season, but fire regimes over a 50 or 100-year period. And so back in 2014, Dan Abibi, who's in the picture next to me there, he and I got together to start building this model, which has been named FROST, which is Fire Regimes Operation Simulation Tool. Also a lesson in picking an acronym early on in the process that really you want to stick with, because we mentioned it to someone and it stayed there for the rest of time. But it's grown into a whole range of other tools which have fun names as well. But the way FROST works is it ticks across, and every day the model says, what's the weather today? Am I likely to have ignitions? And if it's a yes for ignitions, it's how many ignitions am I likely to have? And then it works out where in the landscape those ignitions might occur or are most likely to occur, and at what time of the day they're likely to occur. And these are all based on known patterns of ignitions and timing, etc., within that particular region. Once that happens, we grab the hourly weather, we grab the fuel, and we grab any fire suppression we've put into that model, and we go off and simulate fires for that day. And then we do that day after day across the fire season. Then we do that for seasons for 70 to 100 years in a row to get an idea of the fire regimes that might be there. We also have a fuel treatment mechanism in there, which simulates prescribed burning. This diagram, sorry, is a little bit out of date because we can also do mulching and strategic fuel breaks in there as well. And then we look at how they all interact to change the fire behavior model and to change the fuel that's there. And what we end up with is this beautiful fire history as if we had perfect knowledge. We know it's imperfect, but it's a perfect knowledge given the limitations of the model. And we can calculate human impacts on human values and environmental values as well in a far more rigorous way than what we could in the flat-based risk modeling that we've been doing elsewhere. So I just wanted to show you a few examples of how we've been able to use that and some of the insights we've been getting. So Sarah McCall-Gosden, who was a PhD with our group and now postdocing with Sabine Kazel, looked at a whole range of landscapes across a climate limited to fuel limited gradient. So places like East Gippsland, they always have lots of fuels. They're very productive forests, but their climate generally limits the amount of fire that occurs. So it only dries out every 10 or so years. Well, historically, it probably would have been 20 years, but there's been 3 events in the last 20 years, so it's probably a higher rate now. And so we say that's a climate limiting system similar to the alpine areas. But if you move across, say, to the Grampians or the Adelaide Hills, these are very dry areas. So the fuels are not limited. The availability of the fuels are not limited by climate, but they have very low fuel loads. And so they only switch on when we have sufficient fuel in that landscape to burn. Again, historically, that might be changing. So we wanted to see, are the changes we see in both the climate limited and the fuel limited systems going to be the same? So Sarah picked out these things. I'll jump over that one because that's just saying climate limited, fuel limited, and then came up with these sorts of graphs. I'll step through one to try and make them make a bit more sense. But the big step from the real now to the real future is from the red to the dark blue. And what we did, we changed for the yellow, we changed the climate only, and for the blue, we changed the fuels only. And what you can see for Adelaide is that when we change the climate and change the fuels, it's increasing. This is the area burnt by high intensity fire. It's the same for other metrics. Everything's going up across 6 different climate models. If we go to the East Gippsland, which is down the bottom, it's a bit of a different picture. One of the models is predicting this CSIRO-R1 is predicting almost no change, but the rest of them are predicting a bigger change with climate sometimes driving it a long way up, not so much. So there's a bit going on, and even sometimes the fuels are actually driving it down as well if we reduce the fuels. But the key message is, and hopefully these work, it's not going to work for that one, sorry. Animations are not my friend. The key message is that as we start to combine fuels, weather, and dryness together, we're seeing an increase in almost every scenario. Sorry about those. And this is across that climate gradient. So the 0, we've just zeroed it to make it the same for everything. And so these are the percent change in annual area burnt, slightly different metric. But again, for the future, we're looking at this dark blue dot. And you can see the percent change is an increase in all regions, with the more climate limited ones having a bigger change and the fuel limited ones having a smaller change. But when we say smaller change, we're talking about a 10 to 50% increase in fire. So that's still a pretty big change in my books in terms of what's going on in terms of the area and then frequency and so on. Sarah also was able to use the model to look at in the area around alpine ash. And looking at a few different models there. Again, the top graphs are showing the area burnt, but these bottom graphs are saying the annual number of hectares burnt by short interval fires. So for those of you who know alpine ash, it's an obligate cedar. It needs a long interval between fires for the ash to grow up from seed, become mature, and set seed again. And the different colours represent different intervals, with the red being the longer interval and the blue being the shorter interval. But pretty much what we're seeing is there's increases in every one of those scenarios under the future climate of the amount of area affected by these short interval fires. We then were able to take this information and work out where the high risk areas were likely to be. fortuitously or not, Black Summer happened and DECA were very interested about where the high risk areas are. And we're actually then funding the lower risk areas because they were the ones where they were likely to get the greatest success. So it was a fortuitous bit of research that came through just at the right time. The other thing we've done with Frost and working with DECA, we've expanded the range of metrics that we've had there, working with a whole range of people throughout Uni of Melbourne and outside the Uni of Melbourne. I won't read through the whole list, but if you go down the values, there's biodiversity, carbon, cost of treatments, human health, infrastructure, agriculture is missing out of there, sorry. Some cultural values. We haven't found a way to work appropriately with Indigenous values, but we're slowly working on that with groups in New South Wales and also with groups here in Victoria. And then some experiential or social values from Rebecca Ford's work. We've also gone through and done a lot of work assigning costs to these things, so getting data from agencies to understand what it is that predicts cost, because we can talk about the management change, the change in management. The numbers might seem good, but if you spend 3 times more than what you save, is it really the right investment? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but surprisingly, this was only the second paper to have done this around the world. So it's been something that's been forgotten because it's sort of assumed it's disaster. We always spend money on fire, but we're trying to pick it apart so we can actually make some good decisions. Which has led us to this project that Erica Marshall has worked on. And I think Erica's met some of you. Erica's currently on maternity leave and hopefully not thinking about work. She assures me she isn't, but she does still send emails from time to time. And Erica led this amazing project where she did a huge amount of simulations with using the Frost information and undertaking a cost benefit analysis. There's lots of details there, but they're probably not the exciting ones. So what she was finding, the same, sorry, we've lost, oh, you can see the legend there, sorry, it's hiding behind your faces. You can see from the legend, the same sort of thing that we saw in Sarah's work is that the amount of area that's going up by wildfire varies between region, again, over that sort of gradient with the expectations that we had before. So, I mean, the other thing we did is we came up with 16 different management strategies, which are listed in cryptic codes down the y-axis there. Don't worry about the codes for now. If you want to read the paper, I can send it around if you're interested or if you have access to it. But what we've got here is the % change in annual cost of both treatments and impacts for these different regions across a range of different climate models. And the red line that you see there is what the cost would be for each of those under the current conditions, and the bar plots are showing you in the future. And you can see for almost every region, the costs are going up regardless of which management strategy you use, until you get across to the ones on the far right there, which are the more fuel limited systems where the value, sorry, I can't quite see, I'm pretty sure it's the Grampians. Yes, the Grampians at the top with the slower fuel responses in response to climate and the future climate mean that the effectiveness of fuel treatment seems to be lasting longer as well. So they become more cost effective in the future. But we haven't really unpicked all the ecological impacts with those slower issues there. And then what we did across all regions, we combined them and we ranked them rather than worrying about the absolute values. And we're able to see whether there were consistent good performers and bad performers. And so the y-axis here is the scenario ranking. And our best scenarios were usually the same too, which was a combination of some prescribed burning and suppression on the fires. And that's sort of giving us a ballpark of a lot of where we are now. On the far right, the worst performer consistently, and I'd say this in terms of total cost of both impacts and management, is the no management scenario. And in the no management scenario, we have no management costs. So what that means is not only is it consistently the most expensive option, but that is all in losses from fire. So when we consider human assets and environmental assets and the cost of impact, no management will have the greatest cost to society moving forward. And this is using not a fuel model that just assumes it goes up with time since fire, but it's a fuel model that peaks and then drops after 30 or 40 years, depending on your vegetation community. So we really can't just step back and let things be and hope for a brighter future, although some people seem to be spouting that information at the moment. And similarly, a suppression-only approach doesn't cut the mustard either. Just a couple of other bits of work that I wanted to touch on, and largely through the magical Erica Marshall. She did this work working with Jessica Keem, who was a PhD student, and then two bearded old guys on the end. And what she was looking at is when Jess identified a number of biodiversity hotspots in the Otway Ranges using some very interesting methods. And then they came up with a whole bunch of different management strategies that they could use around trying to protect those biodiversity hotspots from fire, to try and reduce the fire in that area, because they were late successional species, which is a terrible term in my mind, but those ones that are more sensitive to fire and needing some time to recover. And so what they found is there's a lot of noise in the way you do it and a lot of uncertainty, but the best approach, which is this one on the right, which is treating the biodiversity hotspots a bit like a community, and doing a lot of heavy treatment around the edge where you might sacrifice some biodiversity for the sake of protecting the biodiversity in there. And that gave the greatest reduction in the chance of fire burning into those areas. And then Erica also went crazy on this other project with Greening Australia. These look like horrible pictures, but I'll step you through them slowly. We're looking at the design of green fire breaks, and we came up with a method that people could use to try and understand the values of a green fire break design from biodiversity point of view, fire risk, and also from carbon as well, given the carbon incentives there. And so these diagrams look awful, but if you see this little red circle in the middle, this is the starting values for those landscapes, and these sites are scattered around South Australia, Victoria, and New South Wales. By adding in the planting into that landscape, we can see the changes that occur for different values. And it's not consistent everywhere, but we can see generally the plant species and the animal species and the carbon goes up. And also we can make designs that are changing the fire risk to those people as well. There are trade-offs in some of those sites, and you probably need your good glasses on if you're like me. But yeah, that's the devil's in the detail a bit there, but there are ways we can design vegetation restoration sites that actually increase biodiversity value while making things better from a fire perspective for the people nearby. Of course, it's all landscape dependent, and we've done some other work which is still in the review process, looking at how these plantings make a difference. And the short answer is, if in a really stark landscape, if you're able to add in about 20 or 30% of that landscape with new vegetation, you'll make a difference to fire regimes. Otherwise, you're not really changing landscape fire. So go ahead and do it and get the most you can out of it, which is a pretty good result. And then once you're above 60%, I think you've got to add about 40% to the landscape to really change it, because you've largely got a tree landscape anyway that's carrying the fires.
Trent, I'm just,
Yeah.
oh, cool. I was just going
Nice
to let you
slide.
know you're right on time, knowing that you have to leave.
I gave myself a 5-minute buffer for this exact reason. So just to finish off, and hopefully not to take Vanessa's time, we know things are going to get worse. We know we're going to see more asset losses, biodiversity losses. We know it's going to cost more to manage in most places, but we're also finding ways to look forward and see how we can actually manage things. So we need to start putting that action in place now for future landscapes. So rather than burning for what's here, we need to be burning and thinking, or managing, I should say, not just burning, for what's likely to be there in the future, and actually starting to think about what we want our landscapes to look like in 30 or 50 years, and starting to get them in place, because they're going to be more resilient than trying to just let nature take its course and change it. I think there's going to be some pretty tough environmental decisions, but there's going to be equally tough developmental planning decisions that need to be made. The good news is the inertia in development is much slower than the inertia in environmental management. So I have a positive feeling that we could actually work with a whole range of groups such as yourself, large numbers of Indigenous communities, and actually come up with some ideas of how we can set up landscapes to cope with the changes that are coming with future fire.